The modern incarnation of the vampire is probably one of the best well-known examples of the subjectivity of language and symbols in contemporary art and entertainment. Vampire fiction has become its own subgenre of Gothic fiction, arguably the most popular subgenre of Gothic fiction in the mainstream at the moment. And with that popularity comes a million different interpretations of what a vampire is or represents. What caught my eye when reading an interview of Lauren Owen by Publishers Weekly regarding her first novel The Quick, published earlier last year, was her mention of why she thought vampires remain such a popular creature of the macabre. She talked about how the vampire is a versatile symbol that can be applied to anything, from lowbrow comedy to political argument. Supposedly, this versatility is reflected in the many different incarnations of vampires in the millions of different vampire fictions that are released into the popular culture these days. My favourite is Terry Pratchett's vampire photographer Otto from his Discworld novel The Truth, where the vampire is humorously painted to be a recovering alcoholic, playfully symbolised by him trying to overcome his addiction to blood. I thought about this as I reflected on the similarities and differences between Lauren Owen's approach to vampires in The Quick and their launch into the mainstream media consumers' attention in Bram Stoker's 1987 classic Dracula. Lauren Owen is most definitely correct in her claim that vampires are a versatile symbol that can be applied to anything, although I don't think she would be especially keen to walk the full anarcho-subjectivist mile and agree that this philosophy should be extended onto other symbols and narrative tropes in fiction, because while her first novel at least shows an attempt to establish its own unique take on vampire lore, every other facet of the novel is safe and cliché, never deviating from a story and writing style that can be described as anything better than tired and boring. The story stars siblings James and Charlotte. James takes the reins during the first arc of the novel, during which he travels to London to become a tortured poet and inadvertently ends up in a gay sexual relationship with his roommate that begins a sinister descent into the secret society of vampires known as the Egolius Club. Meanwhile, his sister Charlotte, on suspicion from his lack of communication, travels to London and teams up with two vampire hunters, one of whom is a dual knife-wielding trapeze artist who might be promiscuous, I think. I never really got clarification on that. And the pair partake in their respective adventures defying the evil, sinister vampires. It's a slog of a story and it contains no surprises. Nevertheless, it deserves closer examination, if only because of the way it shamelessly boasts its credentials on the cover. Hilary Mantel and Kate Atkinson show up fresh from the Costa Awards to give endorsements, and Lauren Owen herself boasts not only an MA in Victorian literature, but also that she is currently chasing her PhD in Gothic literature and fan culture. The selling point of this novel, then, is that Owen should be able to draw from her studies of the Gothic and the macabre in order to deliver a vampire novel with some bite, which could not be further from the case. Regardless of what you think Bram Stoker's vampires symbolized specifically, whether they be homosexuals and sexually liberated women, foreigners, colonialism, STDs, or whatever, there are several things that we as readers can infer from their presence in the narrative. The vampires came from a foreign land and were usually kept at arm's length by the story. Dracula himself didn't show up for most of the novel, and the reassurances from Van Helsing that the protagonists just need to trust him because they wouldn't believe him if he told them the truth established the vampires as an encroaching and mysterious alien entity, implying that they were primarily an outside force that sought to silently invade and disrupt good English Christian lifestyle. Lauren Owen is probably aware of this, and in trying to give her vampires their own identity separate from Stoker's, she's chosen to place their base of operations right in the centre of London and cast them as behind-the-veil manipulators, with their own politics and clearly defined goals for society. No longer are they an encroaching unseen force from outside, they're inside and have already established a circle of power in the heart of the English capital, known as the Egolius Club, a sinister organisation that can bend highly ranking and powerful people to their will, as demonstrated by the novel's dead tone introduction and some other part of the book midway through where the vampires start talking about cleansing society of moral delinquents. Both of these incidents seem like highly disingenuous events, since in every other part of the book the vampires are merely quarrelling in a local squabble within their own ranks and with a rival group of female vampires, so they really don't appear to be as much of an encroaching threat upon society, whether from internally or externally, as much as they seem to be a crime family having a typical crime family feud. Speaking of that group of female vampires, one of the reviews of The Quick Online stated that the unique angle this book supposedly had was vampires as the patriarchy, because the Egolius Club is made of entirely male vampires who never let women into their ranks. But if that's the case, then that leads me to question what the Egolius Club rival female band of vampires is supposed to represent thematically, and the only thing I can think of is feminism. But if the female vampires are supposed to represent feminists, then Lauren Owen has painted a subtext in which both feminists and the male-dominated establishment are both represented by blood-sucking monsters, which, regardless of which side you're on, is a gross oversimplification of the issue for the sake of a joke that isn't funny. If you're expecting the name Egolius to factor into the novel's symbolism, you might not be surprised to hear that it doesn't. Egolius is a genus of owls. An owl is the symbol of the Egolius Club, and owls are just cool, I guess. but it gives the publisher an excuse to put a token drawing of a mysterious owl in flight on the cover in an attempt to make you think the story is going to be more stylish than the uninspired writing style would have you believe. With the vampires being established as a body of power and influence in the heart of English society, the premise is optimal to have the city of London populated by citizens who casually make reference to the Egolius Club in order to slowly clue in the protagonists and by extension the readers to the politics of an alternate version of London controlled by vampires. But instead, Lauren Owen still tries to remain in line with Stoker and keep the vampires at an arm's length, or at least an elbow's length. The vampires of the Quick certainly have more narrative presence than in Dracula, but the vampire characters are almost always kept out of the spotlight and aren't given any time to flesh them out, which would seem appropriate if they were meant to be a mystery, and despite them definitely not being that, I have a suspicion that this was the intention. The blurb and the introduction set up the Egolius Club as a mystery to be solved, and in the first 100 pages you might not even suspect that you were reading a vampire novel until someone gets their neck bitten out. But even after you're able to infer from the fucking obvious that the mysterious Egolius Club is yet another vehicle to deliver vampires into a story, the novel demonstrates that it doesn't respect the intelligence of its audience and flat out gives away that the Egolius Club is vampires in the very next chapter, as though it expected the reveal to be some kind of shocking twist. After which it throws any sense of mystery out the window, although for some reason seems to still pretend that the vampires are a mystery, which is extraordinarily awkward to read. The word vampire itself is I think only used once or twice in the entire text to keep them mysterious, but the novel dedicates extraordinarily long lengths of time to explaining exactly how the vampires work. The book seems to expect that vampires are just inherently mysterious and that their simple inclusion renders the novel a sense of mystique. But mystery is the kind of thing that fades over time. Stoker was able to utilize the mystique of vampires to its fullest, since he could reasonably expect that his audience might not be as saturated with vampire lore as a modern audience is today. I don't know exactly what Lauren Owen's inspirations were. I've been told that they were supposedly Sarah Waters and Anne Rice, but in reading the publisher's weekly interview, I get the impression that Lauren Owen wanted to recapture the mystery and novelty of vampires in a media landscape that has explored them to death and beyond. And I will say, if I'm correct on that assumption, that her intentions are noble. I like vampires. I think they're a really cool creature. Owen says that the vampire trope shifts horror and pleasure onto a fantastic or grotesque canvas, but she failed to deliver on that horror or that pleasure, and at no point would I call her novel fantastic or grotesque. At some point this novel had my interest, but then it just made me angry, and then it just made me bored. I give this novel no recommendations.